Christine Abizaid leads the NCTC, or the National Counterterrorism Center. It is a creation of the U.S. government after September 11th to have one place where you would have the FBI, the CIA, the DIA, the NSA, Homeland Security, Customs and Border, all of the intelligence agencies involved in the collection and analysis of information about terrorism in one place with all their databases, so that there'd be no issue about connecting the dots or coordinating the efforts. But it has been 20 some odd years since 9/11 and the commission of the NCTC. So in the overview, what is the state of the NCTC and your view of global terrorism today?
Well, thank you. And it's really an honor to be here and to talk to you, especially, John. So look, I mean, everything you just described about the National Counterterrorism Center is true. It is an interagency format of individuals that bring their own home agency perspective into a world of shared data so they can connect the dots, so they can stay laser focused on what the global terrorism environment is producing and what we need to do to enable our country's ability to protect against it. And 20 years after 9/11, in fact, NCTC is going to celebrate its 20th anniversary in August. 20 years after the establishment of NCTC, it's actually now more important than ever. We were talking earlier about how when NCTC was first established, it was another, now four-letter agency that was involved in a counterterrorism fight when everyone was working on Al-Qaeda as a top priority, then ISIS and various permutations of the threat. In today's environment, in today's national security prioritization framework that rightly puts strategic competition above many other national security priorities, having an organization that exists only to do counterterrorism is really important for the sustainability of our capability against the global threat. And so, in the time that I've had the opportunity and the honor, really, to lead it at NCTC, in the 3 years of my tenure, I've really seen the value of that creation right after 9/11 of an organization whose job and singular focus is counterterrorism.
And I was talking to Paul Abizaid from the FBI, and one of the things we hit on was cyber, because the FBI's job is everything. But NCTC's job is only one thing, right, which is preventing that next attack. And it doesn't have to necessarily be the next attack in the United States. So let's get right on to the state of terrorist organizations, your view of their current status and capabilities today. ISIS, Al-Qaeda.
Sure. Oh, so generally what I would say is, we are in an elevated global threat environment. And I don't say that lightly. I mean, in the tenure that I've had as the director of this organization, this is the first time where the elevated threat globally has really, I think, raised significant alarm bells, not only in the West, in Europe, in parts of South and Central Asia, in Russia, as we saw recently, but in the United States homeland.
What are the signs of that?
So, well, one, I would say that a lot of the global threat environment and the elevation that we're seeing today is a product of the post-October 7th environment. Hamas, even though it's not an organization that is targeting Americans globally, its actions really came on top of what was already a diverse threat landscape of actors that are motivated by Al-Qaeda. ISIS is still a persistent threat, as Paul was talking about. You've got homegrown violent extremists and racially motivated violent extremists all sort of reacting to not only Hamas's attack, but the aftermath of the conflict in Gaza. And it's creating energy in the system, a susceptibility for individuals across the globe, an introduction to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that is inflaming tensions and has this potential to create a next generation of global threat actors. And that Gaza effect is happening at the same time that, in particular, we see the ISIS network sort of resettling after a period of disquiet. And by that, I mean, in my first couple of years as the director, we saw 3 different ISIS emirs meet their demise in Syria. That hasn't happened again here for another year. We saw the fall of Kabul and actually the pretty significant counterterrorism pressure that the Taliban put on ISIS Khorasan, the branch that existed there. They, in large part, pushed them out, or at least very senior members of ISIS-K, they pushed out of Afghanistan. Well, now they're settling and finding ways to pull off attacks like we saw in Kerman, Iran, that killed almost 100, like we saw in Moscow that killed nearly 130 people. And sort of, this ability of the global ISIS enterprise to, even without significant territorial sort of solidity, the ability to reach out virtually to a network of supporters, some of whom are going to conduct attacks, is quite concerning. And so the energy in the system created by Gaza, the ability of an organization like ISIS to exploit that energy because of more sophisticated propaganda, because they have evolved their model to tap into that energy in a way that we haven't seen in years, really raises a significant concern for us in the counterterrorism community.
So let's jump back on 2 or 3 of those. If you look at Kerman, the attack in Iran, I mean, the ironies abound. It was an attack on the memorial service for the individual who used to run the Quds Force that was behind numerous terrorist attacks, and it was attacked by terrorists. But in the Kerman case, there were indicators and warnings passed on by the intelligence community to the Iranians. Highly unusual to be sharing intelligence information with the Iranians. In the Moscow incident of the shopping mall, there was indicators and warning, very specific intelligence information passed on to the Russians. We've always had this habit of being politics neutral when it came to counterterrorism information, which is, if we had it, we would give it to anybody, whether it was our best friend or our worst enemy, in the duty to warn sense.
That's
right. Yet in both of those cases, it seemed to be ignored as kind of, it's coming from the United States, what, we shouldn't trust it? Both of those attacks could have been prevented, possibly. What do you see there?
Well, so first of all, I mean, our principle on duty to warn is as true now as it was in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. I mean, we will share information that will protect innocent lives, no matter where those innocent lives are. And we do it at some risk to our sources and methods, some concern about what terrorists will see in our warning process that will allow them to adapt. And I mean, you look at something like Moscow and the warning that we provided not only to Russia, but also to American citizens in Russia. That warning was dated March 7th. The attack happened on March 22nd. There were disruptions in Russia that happened in between, and it still didn't successfully disrupt that particular attack. And so I'm less. I see it less as either ignoring or somehow being suspicious of the information we're providing, though I'm certain that is going on, and more that we are dealing with a challenging threat environment. We're dealing with a challenging threat environment where terrorists can operate using ubiquitous encrypted technology and make it difficult for us to sort of see and be able to disrupt ahead of time the kinds of attacks that can actually, with relatively simple methods, cause devastating damage. The other thing I would say is that the Russia attack and the Iran attack, while sort of seemingly coming from the same ISIS enterprise, used 2 very different ways of being successful. In the Iran attack, we saw suicide bombers deployed from somewhere enter into Iran and blow themselves up and kill a lot of civilians. In Russia, we saw really individuals that were already in place radicalize, connect with the ISIS enterprise, and find a way to conduct an attack consistent with those goals. And while we're concerned about the Kerman model for all of the reasons you would expect, that virtual model expands the reach of ISIS in ways that really they wrote the playbook on in 2016. In 2015 and 2016, we saw it in the US, we saw it in Europe. And we're really worried about them sort of leveraging that again in this next evolution of their model.
The world is upside down in an environment where we're sharing CT intelligence with Iran, and the Taliban and the United States are both focusing on degrading the capabilities of ISIS in the form of the Khorasan group. But how would you assess the state of the Khorasan group now? Because when I was dealing with the Khorasan group, we were looking at them as not just right there, but as an external operations entity.
The Khorasan group, the ISIS Khorasan group, is probably the most significant sort of additive capability we've seen to the global ISIS network in the last 3 years. And it hasn't been without its challenges. Again, I mean, the Taliban pushed key operators out of Afghanistan. We saw this group struggle to really gain a foothold and determine its direction. And then sort of Kerman and Moscow happen in rapid succession in a way that has its own ability to build momentum. Again, likely leveraging individuals more susceptible in today's environment than in a year ago, because you've got this sort of backdrop of the Gaza conflict energizing more people, attracting more people to groups that claim for their own sort of exploitation of the conflict, claim to represent a way to get back at great powers. And so ISIS Khorasan is absolutely a concern. It's always been a top intelligence priority. It's, you know, since before the fall of Kabul, we all knew that we would have to watch the development with this group in particular. And I think what we're seeing is, again, their ability to adapt to their environment, their new establishment of an operating model that is both virtual and physical in ways that make them very difficult to get after.
If we pivot to Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda was bin Laden till there was no bin Laden, then it was Zawahiri till Zawahiri was taken out, but there was a signal there, which is, would Al-Qaeda, after the Taliban regained control of much of Afghanistan, would they regain sanctuary? And the signal was he was killed in the penthouse of a building next to a government ministry. It certainly seemed like Al-Qaeda was rebuilding Afghanistan from a headquarters standpoint just by the leader of Al-Qaeda's presence, not in some cave in the hinterland, but right in the middle of the capital city. Where do you see Al-Qaeda now? Where do you see them vis-a-vis Afghanistan? Where do you see them vis-a-vis the competition between groups like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, even Hezbollah and others for dominance of the terror field?
Well, so, I mean, you characterized in an earlier session them sort of being the leader of a franchise model. The Al-Qaeda brand is meaningful, but whether Al-Qaeda core is leading it, I think, is a big question. And I think that's right. You know, you look at the presence of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, Pakistan, you know, this centralized model that we fought so hard against in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, and the group is at its historical nadir in that region. I can see why the presence of Zawahiri in Kabul would signal to many the rebuilding of an al-Qaeda presence in Afghanistan. In fact, it probably reflects more about the relationship between al-Qaeda and the Taliban, right? It probably reflects that, you know, the al-Qaeda-Taliban relationship is meaningful enough that al-Qaeda will respect the Taliban's desire not to once again become a platform for external attacks. And, you know, as we look at the global al-Qaeda network, you know, I'm a lot more worried about Al-Shabaab and JNIM in Africa and the significant growth we've seen of both of those branches in those parts of the world. I'm still very concerned about Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula because they are so innovative and have for so long focused on the United States of America. Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan is not the driver behind the global Al-Qaeda network today.
So AQAP used to have the ticket for Al-Qaeda on external operations, underwear bombers and, you know, multiple plots, a lot pointed at aeronautics or CONUS attacks. Are they still?
I don't know. You know, the Emir of AQAP recently met his demise, natural causes, right? There have been other recent talent losses that AQAP has experienced. You know, some just because Yemen's a really hard place to survive. But we are always attuned to anything that Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is doing. And we are always suspicious about what we can't see. I am as worried about the gaps in Yemen as I am about what we know they're up to at any given time. And so we're never going to be comfortable with the threat that could be posed from Yemen while AQAP still exists as an organization.
When Zawahiri was killed, there was a lot of discussion about who would be the next emir of Al-Qaeda. Saif al-Adil was a name that was thrown around a lot, and yet, while they must have somebody running the organization, we haven't seen the announcement, the coronation, the videotaped messages of propaganda. What does that signal to you, and who's running it?
Well, I mean, I think it goes back to what we just talked about. You see the rise of the franchisees, right? The leader of Al-Shabaab, you've got Darrier there, you've got the leader in JNIM, Iyad Ghali, you've got, you know, whoever has now succeeded Batarfi in Yemen. Saif al-Adil is, you know, still a senior respected member of Al-Qaeda who, you know, is also sitting in Iran. And that he's sitting in Iran automatically makes him highly suspicious for the rest of the Al-Qaeda network, even if he wants to try and pull the strings from there. And so I actually think this question of who's running Al-Qaeda today is a really good example of why Al-Qaeda is not functioning as the global threat that it was when we were dealing with it on 9/11.
So it's a convenient time to turn to Iran, whereas, you know, Iran has long been categorized by the United States as a state sponsor of terrorism. But in the last few years, we have seen more and more indications of Iran willing to not just operate against the United States, but operate on U.S. soil, target U.S. interests overseas, which they'd done before. But we've seen Iranians arrested and charged in public cases for collecting target folders of critical infrastructure targets, of U.S. government targets, of tourist locations, presumably for the day when someone in Iran, Qasem Soleimani or his replacement, would press the red button and say, it's time to do an attack on U.S. soil. We have also seen them go after Iranian dissidents on U.S. soil. An individual was arrested with connections to the Iranian government with an AK-47 stalking the porch and front yard of an Iranian dissident in Brooklyn. Is that a shift in terms of boldness and a step forward?
I think it is. You know, Iranian state agents, the Iranians' willingness to use, you know, various types of surrogates in these global operations, you know, it's more brazen than we've seen at any time since the 80s and 90s. And, you know, their willingness to do all of the things you just outlined in the United States homeland, their leadership of the axis of resistance in the midst of this conflict that stems out of Gaza, but they're using sort of their surrogate networks in the region. You know, you look at a group like Hezbollah, which is actually staying pretty disciplined on the Israeli-Lebanon border, but that also has a global terrorist capability, and in fact last year was disrupted in South America by a number of operations. You know, we've got to be really concerned about the global Iranian threat and what would lead them to leverage that global capability in terrorist attacks abroad. And so when you think about the dynamic that the last panel was talking about throughout the Middle East, you know, every day in my briefing room, we're looking at what's happening there and whether or not we're dealing with a trigger point that internationalizes the conflict even more, that takes it out of the region and actually brings global consequences to those that are deemed a party to it, whether it's Israeli and Jewish interests worldwide or whether it's the United States interests for its perceived support for Israel. And it's a dynamic that I think is incredibly complicated because it is pursued by a state with state-like capabilities. And in the case of ISIS, you're talking about clear intent, but, you know, a question about their build of capabilities. In the case of Al-Qaeda, you're always worried about, you know, what capability they can bring to bear for their clear intent. In the case of Iran, in the case of Hezbollah, it's flipped. You know they have the capability. The question is, what strategic calculus are they going to put into play that actually leads to attacks against the United States and potentially in the United States?
You talked about the axis of resistance. Israel suffered a devastating attack by Hamas on its own soil. As Ronan Bergman told us a short time ago, a stunning intelligence failure by anybody's standards, which is they literally had the 74-page playbook that laid out the attack step by step and failed to assess it as credible, even though it was being pushed by their own intelligence analysts from their own military intelligence community. But then on the other hand, you have the devastating results in Gaza, death tolls that are going to be approaching 40,000 people not long from now, and the disparity between the number of Hamas fighters killed versus the number of civilians, women, children. On the other hand, behind all this, you see Iran operating the axis of resistance, multiple proxy groups that are keeping both the U.S., the Israelis, and others in the region, including shipping off balance on their back heel, drawing them in further to what could be a regional conflict. It seems out of all the players there, the United States, the Israelis, the people of Gaza, the only people who look like they're in control or could be called a winner is Iran and the network they've very carefully built over multiple decades, which essentially is a terrorist network.
So, you look at something like October 7th, and, in this time of strategic competition, as resources are moving to harder and harder targets, it reminds you that you have to stay focused on the global threat environment at the same time. And I mean, Hamas's attack, not directed at the United States, is one of the most consequential terrorist attacks we've seen in the post 9/11 era. It has completely upended U.S. strategy in the Middle East, driven a whole different level of geopolitical dynamic, and it will set the stage for a next generation of terrorism that I think will be defining for how we at NCTC work. And so something like October 7th reminds you not only that a small non-state actor can still do devastating damage of great strategic consequence in a geopolitical environment that is already overtaxed, but also they can do it and surprise all of us at the same time. And it reminds us, whether you're focused on the Iran threat, the Al-Qaeda threat, the ISIS threat, the lone actor threat, the racially or ethnically motivated violent extremist threat, the anti-institutionalist, anti-government threat, all of these threats exist all at the same time, and we have to be vigilant.
And yet, if you look at the larger intelligence requirements of the intelligence community, you see China, you see Russia, you see a war in Ukraine, which is out of the CT counterterrorism realm. You see the war in Israel, which may emanate from the counterterrorism realm, but goes into the defense and political realm. After 9/11, the NCTC was created and then flooded with resources from all the intelligence agencies. I'm going to assume that there has been a pulling back of some of those resources to devote to these other intelligence requirements. You must feel like, you know, that person who was juggling all of the plates up in the air at the same time, trying not to drop any of them.
Yeah. I mean, look, we've got a persistent threat environment. In fact, a threat environment that now is on the upswing. We know from history that the global counterterrorism trends are such that you're going to deal with threats in waves. You need a sustainable CT enterprise out of the United States and the partner communities throughout the world that is prepared to deal with those waves of capability from terrorist organizations, and and still make room for all of the other things that we need to do as a United States government, as a national security community. And so again, I mean, I go back to where I started. It means that an organization like NCTC today is maybe even more important than on the day it was founded, because it is trying to assure that sustainable CT posture that will allow us to sprint to the next evolution of the threat and keep it at bay. And so, I'm really incredibly proud of the work that the men and women at NCTC do every day, not only to understand what's going on in the threat environment, but to lead a global counterterrorism enterprise that's responsible for responding to that threat environment. And we do so with fewer resources, sure, than we have had in the counterterrorism community in the past, but without taking our eye off the ball. And that's what's really important.
So to close, the entire purpose and meaning of this conference is the global security forum, the global partnership, the global fabric that has to be woven tighter and stronger than the network that terrorist organizations put together to counter it. What's your message to this audience and to our international partnerships that exist and the ones that could?
Let's avoid a false choice, that it is either strategic competition and hard targets or conflict in the Middle East, or it's counterterrorism. It is all intertwined. There are dynamics even associated with the conflict in Ukraine that affect the way in which terrorists might seek to exploit it. And it is only by understanding sort of the complexity and the totality of the international security environment that you'll be able to deal with different manifestations of it, including in the counterterrorism realm. Partnerships are key, collaboration is key, transparency is key, And so ensuring that this, as all the other dynamics that we're working on, stays on the top of your agenda is really important.
Well, Christine Abizaid, you have a tough job. I know you lead a great team, and I know you'll make great partnerships. Thank you for this today.
Thank you, John.